Okay, I'm gonna do this thing, take off this mask. Hope it's okay if I'm up here. Grazie mille, thank you very much to Marta and the rest of you for having me. For those of you who are not in the studio audience, there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. So if I seem disjointed, it's not for the normal reasons. It's because I'm trying to manage a bunch of things. This talk, I should also say, this is the first in-person talk I've given in almost 2 years. So I feel like I don't know, like a performing band that's returning to their space, weird though that it is. So also probably a bit rusty. So a little bit of background. This is sort of a culmination or an attempt to bring together two very disparate strands of my research. So a lot of my research concerns whether and how cognition might influence perception. And I have the view that the mind is in fact much more malleable than certain orthodoxies might have it. And another very distinct part of my research is to try to make sense of creativity from a largely naturalistic or scientific perspective. So this paper is an attempt to bring the first to bear on the second, to see if some of the things that I've been working on with respect to cognitive influence on perception might help us to understand creative achievements in some naturalistic way. So that's where we're going. We've already got some glitches. I'm not switching here. Sorry. Oh, now it's going. Okay. So here's an apparent platitude. Creativity in science and art often involves expert level skill. That should sound really plausible. But given what I think is an unfortunately persistent emphasis in creativity research on radical creativity, on genius and sort of romanticized versions of creativity, there's been very little said about how creativity sometimes involves expert level skill. So that's sort of my point of departure. So the thesis I want to explore is that first, expertise can sometimes reach all the way down to the perceptual. This is sort of central to my research project on cognitive influence on perception at the moment. So it's separable from the stuff on creativity. And second, that in some cases, this enables automatic skilled performance with reduced need for working memory specific to the task, which thereby reduces cognitive load and opens up space for novel thinking, imagination, free association, conceptual revision, all the stuff that we think is important for creative thought and behavior. So that's the talk in a very, very small capsule. So in order to make the case for this view, I'll need to work through some relevant empirical research, quite a lot of it, on perceptual expertise as such, then briefly present an argument for why I think those, or at least some of those studies, their data are best explained as genuine cognitive changes on perception, and then make the case, turning to creativity, for how that reduces cognitive load for the expert, and finally conclude that that will give us some plausible psychological framework for understanding some instances of the relationship between expertise, skill, and creativity. Okay, so the talk will break down into these three components. So the first thing I'm going to do is really say a lot without arguing for the things that I say, a lot of things about creativity as I understand it. This is background on how I think about creativity. Then there'll be a longish discussion of perceptual expertise and how I think we should explain it. And then I'll bring the two together. So a lot of my work on creativity has been sort of polemical in nature. I don't know how many of you are aware of this sort of sociological fact. There's not a lot of philosophers talking about creativity. And I think that's unfortunate. I think it's explainable. I think it's probably a feature of the kind of romanticization and the apparent magic of creativity. But I think that shouldn't deter us from understanding creativity and some of its basic psychological mechanisms. And so a lot of my project has been try to sort of chip away at how we might understand creativity from, say, the cognitive sciences. Sorry, making sure both screens are matching. So here's what I call minimal creativity. So some thought or action X is minimally creative only if for some agent A, X is the non-accidental result of the agency of A, and X is psychologically or behaviorally novel relative to A. So I want to highlight a couple of features which will become operative later in the discussion. So I'm drawing on a distinction here from Maggie Bowden between historical and psychological creativity. I really think that Bowden's distinction is one between two different types of novelty. So novelty relative to, say, the history of ideas or some broad comparison class, and novelty relative to the history of a particular agent's ideas or psychology. So a novelty condition, I take it, captures our most basic insight about creativity. Not creative Fs are novel Fs. I think Bowden's important insight is that our interest in creative thought, at least from the perspective of cognitive science, outstrips historical novelty or novelty simplicator. An agency condition captures the fact that creative thoughts and behaviors are ones for which we're responsible, as evidenced by their general praiseworthiness. So creative Fs are the result of agency, where those processes or products have to be linked with agency in the right way. So I think we don't judge happy accidents creative, even if they're interesting or valuable or aesthetically rewarding. Those two features actually, when you put them side by side, present a kind of puzzle, which I'm going to present now and then come back to as a sort of purchase of the account that I want to give of expertise and creativity. So on the one hand, creative achievement is often described, perhaps too romantically, as effortless. And it's often rapid, or as we say, in the moment. Improvisation and performance and sport are good examples. On the other hand, creativity does seem to be an achievement, given our standard practice of praising creative acts and their makers. That's what the agency condition is supposed to capture. The puzzle is to make sense of how you can have both of those at the same time. So we'll come back to that. So this is only a start. That's an only if. But I think it's a way to conceptualize some of the most basic psychological mechanisms or features of creativity. And I think a focus on expertise is another way that we can do that. Closely connected to the thought that creativity necessarily involves agency is a commitment that creativity is primarily a process. So creativity involves creating. Even when our attribution of creativity is ostensibly to a product, or a product will be creative only if it's the result or terminus of a process of the right kind. So creativity is or is partly constituted by a process. So any accurate judgment that X is creative at least partly involves an attribution of a kind of process. Now, this might sound obvious, but it has an important consequence. So to know or understand or properly attribute creativity to anything, even if it's, say, a painting on the wall, you have to some degree, understand the process from which it resulted. And that process, I think, constitutively involves agency. This also has an interesting implication. So creativity is an achievement, and it's an achievement that consists partly in deployment of relevant skills, where the agent is partly responsible for possession of those skills. That encourages, I think, a virtue theoretic treatment of at least some instances of creativity. And just as a sort of point of provocation, I want to ask, to what degree or in what instances do those virtues reach all the way down to the perceptual? Finally, as I hope no one would disagree, the creative process often, perhaps always, involves imagination. One way that I've attempted to flesh this out, and with the aim of somehow capturing how creativity often involves a cognitive breakthrough, is this. So in an earlier paper, I call this the cognitive manipulation thesis. It says that creative thought and behavior, whether it's rich or minimal, requires cognitive manipulation. And that I understand as follows. Cognitive manipulation typically involves voluntarily thinking about the contents of some conceptual space or domain in non-truth-bound ways. So you're not just accurately reflecting the information in the space. In creative processes, this cognitive activity often causally interacts with affective, motivational, inferential, and pre-associative capacities. Now, that's a sort of role for the that we can identify in the creative process. And I think imagination, construed quite broadly, very well, if not ideally, serves that role. And accordingly, it plays, as you would predict if you think of Kant or others who have identified the relationship between imagination and creativity, it importantly plays a central role in much of creative thought and action. Okay. So that's a little bit of background on creativity. Now I want to turn to a kind of separable component of the project, which is to focus on perceptual expertise. And then I'll bring this stuff back to bear on creativity as I've just minimally characterized it. Okay. So I don't know how, I can't see who's in the audience right now, but I take it that there's a lot of philosophers of perception who won't be surprised by the following observation. Philosophers of perception are still talking about hallucination and illusion, right, as a kind of litmus test for the structure and epistemology of perception. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. More generally, there's just a lot of emphasis on error and misrepresentation in philosophy of perception. There's comparatively little research on the positive or on how we might become better perceivers, and it's worth asking why. So here's a question about the architecture of perception. Can sensory perception change in rich experiential sense as an effect of cognitive improvement? And can sensory perception, here's an epistemological analog to that question, improve so as to enhance or better perform relevant epistemic roles? You might look at those questions and think that the answers are obviously obviously yes. I'm looking at my opponents before I say what I want to say, but there are formidable opponents who will give negative answers to these questions, right? So modularity theorists, sparse content theorists, theorists who think that perception has to be objective in some deep way in order to be veridical, they'll be skeptical of positive answers to these questions. Now, against those skeptics, the main thesis of my current overall research project is this, and it looks trivial, but let me tell you why it's not. Perceptual expertise is, in a bona fide sense, perceptual expertise. So perceptual expertise is genuinely perceptual, that's the first conjunct of the claim, and genuinely cognitive. So it involves perceptual changes that depend upon the cognitive etiology of the expert. And the epistemic sort of implication of that claim is that those effects of expertise on perception, those cognitive effects on perception, are epistemically enhancing. So expert perceivers really are expert perceivers. And the way that I flesh this out in the book is in a virtue theoretic sense. So I'm only going to talk about really this architectural claim, and the epistemological claims won't really be relevant to what we talk about today. But if you're interested, here's the book that just has published, and chapters 7 and 8 focus on the epistemology. Okay. So the two architectural claims that I want to make are first that these cases of expertise, which I'm about to discuss, genuinely involve differences in perception and sensory perception between expert and novice. And secondly, we'll come to that after the first, that those changes, some of them depend upon the cognitive, conceptually rich etiology of acquiring those expert skills. Okay, so on to this first one. So you might be a modularist or separately a sparse content theorist about perception. Either view or both will encourage one not to think that learning to spot, say, a lodgepole pine when in the backcountry of Utah, or I suppose the backcountry of northern Italy, spotting that doesn't involve seeing it differently than the novice. It just involves judging differently on the basis of what you see. Why? Well, because perception doesn't capture or isn't influenced in the ways that that explanation would require. So these are sort of the foils that I have in mind in arguing that instead, drawing on various behavioral and neurophysiological studies and data, our best explanation of some of these cases of expertise are going to be ones that involve genuine changes in perception, contrary to those skeptics. So empirical studies on perceptual expertise as such focus on specialized domains and employ a variety of methods to study both real-world experts and lab-trained experts. And I want to provide just a snapshot of some of that research and then say why I think it motivates some profound claims about perception and then finally connect it to what I want to say about creativity. So first, I'll work through some behavioral methods that these experimental psychologists employ. So they study trained experts, so those who are already trained in some specialized domain, for example, radiologists and how they make diagnoses, or bird watchers and how they distinguish distinct individuals within relevant categories of bird. But they also study experts in the lab for both natural objects, such as birds. You can train subjects up to be bird experts. And you can train subjects up to be experts with respect to artificially created objects. So these, for those of you who've never met them, are the greebles. Subjects can be trained to be greeble experts, making fine-grained categorizations and identifying individuals and distinguishing them. These in-lab methods are important because essentially they allow researchers to track the acquisition period when you train someone up to be an expert. So here are some starting observations, thinking about behavioral studies on these experts. Experts of various kinds perform categorization and identification tasks extremely rapidly and accurately. Their performance and their subjective reports across types of expertise commonly bear some features that are worth highlighting. So they often enjoy what we call a pre-identification sense. So for example, expert radiologists can report accurately sensing a tumor before they can accurately say where it is. They often have a limited capacity for description of their methods. They use terms that suggest visual phenomenology. They say things that like, I just see it, or it pops out, or it's salient. They often don't exert any obvious cognitive effort. And at least psychologically speaking, they seem to enjoy a kind of non-inferential automaticity. So different experimental manipulations are employed to interfere with task performance in both experts and novice. And one method that's relevant here is the composite task. So the task here is to determine if the designated target half, which could be the top or bottom from trial to trial, of the second image, which they call the test image, is the same as the relevant half of the first image, which they call the study image. The targeted test half image can be the same as or different from the study half image. And the two halves of the test image can be congruent or not, so they can match like a face. And they can be aligned or not, so match up with respect to alignment or not. So here are the results. Irrelevant object halves, and this is illustrated here with faces, but also with greebles and other objects of expertise. Irrelevant object halves interfere with expert performance. So expert performance degrades when, in the test image, the bottom half of a greeble is incongruent with the target top half. And this effect is significantly modulated by alignment. That is, the magnitude of these interference effects in experts is highest when the object halves of the test image are aligned rather than misaligned. Here's an explanation. Experts rely on holistic processing of objects of expertise, and these composite tasks require them to attend to only one part of the whole. So what the suggestion here is that experts' performance is largely automatic. And so what they should do is selectively attend only to the half of the test image that's to be compared with the half of the study image. And if they did this, the incongruence of the to be ignored half would have no interference effect, but it does, which suggests some kind of holistic processing that, as it were, the expert can't turn off. What these interference effects in composite tasks suggest is that holistic processing co-varies with or becomes more dominant in acquisition of expertise. Moreover, experts rely heavily upon configural information in an object of expertise. So two additional behavioral measures here illustrated with faces, but also used for objects of expertise, are the part-whole task and the spatial versus featural task. So in the first, subjects do significantly better at the task when the test images are wholes. So in this case, two whole faces, rather than when the two images are isolated. So in this case, two pairs of eyes. And in the second task, experts show greater sensitivity to spatial changes than to featural changes. So another related behavioral method involves inversion effects, and most of you are familiar with the Thatcher illusion. So in spite of one's expertise with faces and further your familiarity with famous faces, it's more difficult to detect substantial featural changes, so in this case, complete inversion of the eyes and mouth, in a face that's perfectly inverted. That's what we've got in the top right corner, but those changes are horrifically obvious in an upright face, which is what we've got here, right? So researchers have found similar effects with respect to non-face objects, so cars, greebles, fingerprints, and here dogs. So with faces, we're all experts, but with things like dogs or cars, the inversion effects appear to co-vary with expertise. So it's only in experts that you get a sort of drop in performance where you become worse than the novice when you invert those objects of expertise. Non-face expertise appears to interfere with face recognition expertise, which we all enjoy with important qualifications. And a number of behavioral studies have been done on this phenomenon. So from rapid visual serial presentation, which is what we've got here, and I'll say something about that in a moment, to visual search, to inversion tasks. And in each case, behavioral performance on visual tasks is markedly different for the expert only, and only with respect to the domain-specific objects of expertise. So what happens in these experiments is that when you take someone who's an expert on, say, cars or some other object of expertise and task them in a way that they also have to identify faces, their performance becomes worse than novices because it looks like the expert capacities are competing with something that we all have, namely face recognitional capacities. And so you get this interference. So I'm not going to go into the details of this particular case. What you find is that in a rapid presentation of a set of stimuli where you're supposed to say whether you've seen a face, if those stimuli are coupled with an object of expertise, as you have here on the left in the experimental condition, the experts will perform much less. They can handle much less rapid presentation when they're faced with faces and an object of expertise. And that's not true for non-experts. Just going to skip ahead a little bit here. Okay, so those are some behavioral measures. We can couple those with some neurophysiological measures. So these researchers also use EEG methods to test expert subjects. So the ERP component N170 has an onset latency of 150 to 200 milliseconds post-stimulus, and it's a standard correlate for face perception. So that component responds at higher amplitudes at that temporal scale for faces than it does for non-face objects. Interestingly, you get that same activity with respect to a huge range of expertise types. So you get that same spike in activity at that temporal scale for experts only with respect to their objects of expertise. Experimentalists also use fMRI methods. So two areas of the cortex that are, I'm sure you know this, that are standardly correlated to be, or thought to be face selective are the fusiform face area and the occipital face area. And interestingly, for experts, you find that activity for experts only in those two areas. So it sort of puts a bit of a wrench in the thought that that's a purely face selective area and perhaps an area that's devoted to some kind of visual expertise. Okay. Finally, these experimentalists use eye tracking methods. So eye tracking shows substantial differences in saccadic eye movement, again, across a range of expertise types. So for example, expert radiologists will rely more on holistic processing of an image, on feature-based attentional selection, and so they have to make fewer eye movements for rapid diagnoses. They also make longer saccades, as you can see here, comparing the novice to the expert. Additionally, they find that an expert can make a voluntary eye movement in as quick as 200 milliseconds or 1/5 of a second, and they can make a diagnosis on the basis of that above chance in a forced choice scenario, so blink of an eye. Similar results you find comparing trained artists versus laypersons. So two different sets of images here. The artists show, by contrast to the layperson's better recall of pictorial detail, especially structural, formal sorts of details. And eye tracking reveals significantly different scan patterns. So you get longer saccades and often fewer total eye movements when you compare the trained artists to the novices. Okay, that's a lot of evidence that I've just stacked up. And I've actually only given you a snapshot, believe it or not, of the range of data that's out there. So we know, and you can group them in this sort of color-coded way that I have, we know that there's got to be some important difference between expert and novice at the level of mental representation. The question that I'm interested in is whether this is an importantly visual difference, whether it's a difference in visual representation between the expert and the novice. Taken together, not one of these bits of evidence is by itself conclusive, but taken together, the convergence of the evidence grounds, I think, a strong abductive case for a cognitively sensitive visual perceptual explanation. So first, I want to focus on the visual component of that explanation. So these kinds of studies and data are standardly taken by our vision sciences as measures of or as identifying correlates for visual representation. This kind of automaticity enjoyed by the expert and their sensitivity to configural, holistic, perceptible features and competition with similarly expert requiring representations such as face recognition all suggests that the expert enjoys some distinctive visual representation. Finally, subjective reports of experts indicate a visual phenomenology. They say things like it just appears or pops out or it's salient. They enjoy a speed and automaticity that indicates a non-inferential psychology and involves greater sensitivity to configural and spatial relations of objects of expertise. I think this would plausibly amount to a difference between expert and novice in visual phenomenology. So at least in some cases, I think we've got good reason to think that there's a visual difference between the expert and the non-expert. That's the first part of the plan. Second, I want to suggest that that difference, at least in some cases, is cognitively sensitive. It's not just a matter of exposure or perceptual development or practice. There's a cognitive etiology that is non-trivially sort of responsible for those perceptual changes. So what motivates that? So here again, you can think about my position as contrasted with a foil. So granting that acquisition of so-called perceptual expertise is or involves a genuine perceptual change, a skeptic like this maintains that some kind of purely perceptual learning or adaptation or perceptual development can explain those changes. And so we don't have to, on this view, make any appeal to what the subject knows or believes or what they've learned about the semantic or cognitive content in their domain of expertise. Again, against that foil, I want to adduce various neurophysiological and behavioral evidence and suggest that the best explanation, at least in some cases, is going to be partly cognitive. So those perceptual changes depend upon the cognitive etiology of the expert. So this should seem fairly obvious. Real world, naturally so-called acquired expertise nearly always involves training of techniques loaded with semantic content, categories, high-level concepts. And expert performance often requires more than mere exposure to relevant classes of stimuli and categories at a sufficiently high rate. So for example, radiographic technicians exposed to hundreds of radiograms, but with no training in reading those images, perform no better than chance along certain standard measures for performance. So mere exposure, in other words, doesn't typically suffice for expert performance. This is true also for in-lab expertise training. So mere exposure and or basic category training isn't sufficient to produce behavioral success. So in this study by Tanaka and colleagues, they highlight various important features of expertise training, emphasizing both that explicitory auditory feedback is required, while mere exposure is insufficient to generate expert performance, and that category specification must occur at a grain finer than the basic level. So for instance, subordinate category terms and family level terms like, say, eastern screech owl or wading bird are needed rather than just the basic category bird in order to get those significant expertise points. Moreover, that success persists behaviorally and neurally just in case you've got application or acquisition, I should say, of those fine-grained categories. So then you might say, isn't this just learning to label things? Well, the point that I was just attempting to make is that not all labels make a difference. You need fine-grained labels sometimes to get the differences in performance. And secondly, some of the changes in neural correlates vary only with subordinate category training. So these studies concern another EEG measure known as the ERP250. It has an onset latency of 230 to 330 milliseconds post-stimulus. It correlates with familiar or learned visual objects. So you get a spike in this activity at that temporal scale to your own face. That's something that everyone gets. What's interesting is that this so-called familiarity response occurs for learned objects in visual cortex only after learning fine-grained categorical domain-specific information. So again, not as a feature of mere exposure. Finally, you might think that these cases of perceptual expertise are just cases of, say, enhanced visual acuity or general performance in generally good performance in visual search. But there's reason to think that that's not true. So a set of studies tasked expert radiologists with respect to making diagnoses on radiograms, and then also performing complicated visual searches like finding Waldo in the maddeningly complicated Waldo image. And if you think that, say, the radiologist is just better at visual search, then you would predict that they do better at tasks like these, but they don't. So this suggests that the expert skills don't transfer to similarly complex visual tasks. Instead, they seem to be very domain specific. So those are some of the reasons that I favor a partly cognitive explanation of the expert's performance. So the training regimens for these kinds of expertise are long and laborious and technical. Performance success and correlating neural activity requires more than mere exposure to relevant stimuli, and it often requires acquisition of fine-grained concepts. And the research indicates that skills acquired don't transfer to similarly complex tasks. So those are reasons to think that it has something to do with the conceptual information specific to radiology or bird watching or being a car aficionado. Okay. Now, finally, to bring all of that back to bear on the topic of creativity. So here again is an apparent, but I think largely unexplored platitude. So some creative acts and processes involve the execution of highly domain-specific skills. Creative individuals like these are experts. What I want to suggest is that some of them are plausibly domain-specific perceptual experts in the ways that I just described, and that the cognitive advantages that that expertise enables may help us to partly understand how they achieve their creative innovations. So some domains where individuals act creatively are highly perceptual in nature. Performance in such domains requires, in a non-trivial way, pickup of information through one or more of the senses. What I want to suggest is that in some cases, the creativity that occurs in those domains depends not just on expertise, but on perceptual expertise. Again, some creative individuals, I think, are perceptual experts. So to motivate that claim, I need to answer this question. How does perceptual expertise provide an advantage for thinking or acting creatively? Well, here's a boring answer. Performance in any domain requires knowing how to perform in that domain, right? So you don't know how to execute the improvisation in, say, music if you don't know how to play the relevant instrument. You can't dribble the ball really well if you don't know how to dribble the ball. Here's a more controversial answer. Get it up on both screens. Perceptual expertise provides a genuine cognitive advantage over mere experts and novices by freeing cognitive resources for that thing that I noted earlier, cognitive manipulation, which I think is a role in lots of creativity, which is best or often performed best by imagination. So this is the explanatory thesis that I finally want to clarify and motivate. So back to this stack of evidence. given the evidence that I reviewed, you might already sort of see how the perceptual expert has a cognitive advantage over others. She sees things more rapidly. She does so automatically and often with no feeling of effort. She's more sensitive to patterns and spatial organization than the non-expert. She has more information to inform and organize her judgments within the domain of expertise. So some of the advantages for the expert should already be apparent and uncontroversial. But what is controversial, again, I think, is that some experts are in fact better perceivers. They enjoy enriched perceptual representation of objects, features, and events within their domain. That's the controversial claim that I want to start to motivate and then connect it to a plausible explanation of at least some of creative achievement. So some perceptual experts enjoy rich perceptual content. That cuts against an orthodoxy that many will be familiar with. And that orthodoxy maintains that vision provides information only about properties like color, shape, size, rest, motion, and location. I'm not making any commitment in making this suggestion about admitting kinds into the content of perception. Instead, I'm suggesting that visual representation in these cases, although it is partly constituted by low-level properties, isn't exhausted by them. Instead, it also involves enhanced perceptual sensitivity to patterns, configurations, organizational features, to what you might want to call the gestalts of objects and properties specific to the expert's domain of specialized training. This is true whether the domain concerns radiographic images or red-tailed hawks, but interestingly, I think the lesson can be learned by considering perception of aesthetic properties. So a plausible thesis made famous by Frank Sibley says that aesthetic properties emerge from combinations of basic physical descriptive properties. An additional minimal thesis says that aesthetic properties are nothing more than particular organizations, or at least some of them, or patterns of properties. Some aesthetic properties, and you can include here artistic properties, are gestalt properties. So while there's no single physical description that guarantees that something or event is dynamic or balanced or serene, there is for each of these properties a distinctive gestalt or cluster of gestalts that characterize such aesthetic properties. And this is what one recognizes when one experiences something, say a dance performance, as being balanced. Likewise for artistic properties like, say, being impressionist. This gestalt includes, not an art historian, but I think these are safe, highlighting of natural light and reflection, a regular use of lighter colors, identifiable quick strokes of paint. And so to know impressionism is to know and respond to some cluster of these features. Now, the difference between spotting and not spotting the balanced dance performance or the impressionist painting is plausibly a phenomenological one. Recognizing inexperience an event as balanced, I think, is phenomenally distinct from not so recognizing it. Further, I think this is a sensory phenomenological difference in one's visual experience. So seeing something as balanced or impressionist, thus understood, is a perceptual difference and plausibly one in high level or rich properties. It's not that the impressionist spotter, by contrast to the impressionist naive, perceptually represents distinctive colors or shapes or edges, or at least not just that, but instead differently perceives how those basic perceptual properties are organized. She perceives the impressionism and the work, and this is rich perceptual content. Some then are plausibly aesthetic experts. And notice how well this brief description of those kinds of experts comports with the analysis of perceptual expertise that I've given earlier in the talk. So the ballet instructor is especially adept at perceiving aesthetic properties, say in dancers, like being balanced or serene and unified. And this is a consequence of learning and training. The art historian can well spot impressionist works and their fine details because she has learned a great deal about that artistic movement and is thereby highly sensitive to the organizational gestalts that typify works in that genre. And this expertise may partly consist in the capacity for rich perceptual content. Now you might say, does this mean that all perceptual experts are sensitive to aesthetic properties or that such accomplishments require rich perceptual content, and I want to say no and no. So I want to say instead that aesthetic experts are a subset of experts more generally. Just as there are patterns or gestalts that typify gracefulness, there are patterns or gestalts that typify a tumor in a mammogram or a pattern of offensive play in football. And perceptual content can admit of these task and diagnostically relevant patterns and in ways sensitive to domain-specific and cognitive learning. So while in some instances of expert accomplishment will plausibly have rich content, this by no means is a condition on expertise or perceptual expertise. So you might be thinking, what does any of this have to do with creativity? How do we get some motivation for the controversial answer? That's the thing that I finally want to come back to. And I want to close by answering two related questions. What further empirical evidence do we have for rich perceptual content in cases of perceptual expertise? That's the first question. Second, how does this perceptual advantage generally provide an advantage vis-a-vis the opportunity for creative thought and action? So the first set of considerations concerns visual short-term memory. It's a working memory system or function that encodes only visually acquired information. So VSTM is limited both with respect to how long representations are available for use and how much information it can store. It enjoys an advantage for faces, so you can store more faces in visual short-term memory than you can similarly complex objects. Interestingly, objects of expertise show that same advantage. So for example, car experts show a VSTM advantage for cars despite the complexity of car images. So the VSTM capacity increases to the capacity normal for very simple objects, like 3 or 4 colored circles, for example. This suggests, I think, a visual explanation. So by virtue of more efficient holistic processing of objects of expertise, the category-specific complexity of an object is already represented by perception. When this representation is then given to visual short-term memory, less resources are needed to store or use the representation, since in a sense, vision has already done the work of representing the object or its bound features as being within a category. So this is the first bit of evidence that perceptual expertise frees up cognitive resources. Vision, and perhaps other perceptual modalities, encodes category-specific information for the expert such that she can better recall or use details about objects of expertise. So one way to explain, at least partially, the unpredictable or surprising or creative move is that visual short-term memory for such a perceptual expert, in this case, the elite footballer, is already encoding relevant information about the situation. So spatial orientation of opponents, their speed and direction and movement, and speed and direction of the movement of the ball. And this is a clear advantage over the less skilled, less expert player. So vision does more, as it were, for the expert, and with that richness comes speed, efficiency, and accuracy. I realize that this is just I should know my audience, right? This is a very bad choice of footballer. So Verratti or Jorginho would have been better. Piola. Similar stories could be told for a variety of other domains of expertise. So the sculptor, the surgeon, the architect. This advantage in working memory that I just described is corroborated by a second line of empirical research. So in the 60s, researchers used pupillary response measures to identify task-sensitive cognitive load, especially demands on working memory. So the idea here is very simple. As working memory demands go up for a task, pupil dilation increases linearly. And just to be clear, that's not an effect specific to perceptual tasks. You'll get this kind of correlation for example, complicated arithmetic tasks. More recently, researchers have used these methods to measure differences in cognitive load between experts and novices. And what they find is that the expert physician, for example, by contrast to, say, a resident or a medical student, exhibits less pupillary dilation in response to the same domain-specific tasks and questions. Again, the idea here is that dilation is taken to correlate with demands on working memory. So this should suggest that those experts suffer less cognitive load, less demand on working memory by contrast to novices. And this enables, and the pupillary measures corroborate, a cognitive efficiency for the expert. So putting these two bits of research together, the reduced stress on working memory for the expert could be enabled by automatic visual pickup of domain relevant information, be it patterns or categories. So this is an important cognitive benefit of genuine perceptual expertise. In turn, I think we get a motivation for the controversial answer. You get freed up cognitive resources in working memory in the expert, which allows for the cognitive manipulation, which I suggest is needed for novel thought and action. So turning finally back to those concepts of creativity with which I began, the idea in brief is that in cases of creativity, we often need what I call cognitive manipulation. That typically involves voluntarily thinking about the contents of some conceptual space or domain in non-truth-bound ways. And imagination construed broadly, I think, well serves that particular psychological role. So the line of thought here is this: for the expert, the visual or other perceptual system is doing automatically some of the domain-specific work. It's picking up the information that the non-expert would have to laboriously judge, reason about, infer if she could identify that information at all. That frees up resources in perception, whether it's visual attention or visual search, and in working memory that allows for a variety of cognitive manipulation, for imagination of various sorts, imagery, free association, for those things that I think well serve the cognitive manipulation role. So I'm going to skip this because I don't have time, but focusing on imagery in particular, because we know a lot more about it scientifically than other forms of imagination, there's good evidence that visual perception, visual short-term memory, and visual imagery all share neural correlates. So if I'm right, the vision for the expert picks up more information that affords neural resources for imagery, since it's not being taxed by vision. Okay, get back then these items. So I think the controversial answer is plausible, at least for some instances of expertise and creativity. When one reaches a level of expertise that goes all the way down to the sensory perceptual, where vision, say, does more of the work for you as a result of what you've learned in a domain, then you have more resources to perform skillfully in novel and innovative ways. So finally, I want to know how this comports with thinking about creativity in the minimal ways that I favor. So this was the minimal account of creativity. The perceptual expert is responsible for the domain-specific cognitive learning that results in her perceptual skills, which is consistent with her being unable to predict any individual creative act that she achieves. But it nonetheless gives some sense of some of the etiology of her achievements where she's responsible for that etiology. So she's responsible for becoming an expert footballer or an expert surgeon. The cognitive advantage with respect to novelty, we can say this with respect to novelty, the cognitive advantage provided by perceptual expertise enables or increases resources for imagination and thus resources for novel thought and performance. So the architectural story given about the cognitive etiology and perceptual nature of expertise helps both to explain how some creative achievements occur and in some ways justifies their being described both in terms of agency and novelty. What these experts have done, what they're to be credited for, in essence, is changing how they perceive within a domain. And not in spite of, but because of those expert perceptual skills, they're able to do, at least in some cases, something novel, even relative to their own high levels of achievement. Finally, just to close, recall this puzzle of the effortless agent. So on the one hand, creative achievement is often described as effortless, rapid, in the moment. On the other hand, it's the sort of thing that we praise. And you don't praise things if you don't think the person praised is responsible for the action in question. So there's a tension between the novelty and the surprise and the agency in the sense that the person has to somehow be credited or responsible for what they've done. Here's the idea. Insofar as it contributes to some creative acts, perceptual expertise makes sense, I think, of that tension. So as explained here, some experts develop a reliable perceptual disposition or skill, and one that affords cognitive resources for novel thought and action. That skill deploys automatically, most centrally in ecologically valid contexts. And this automaticity makes some sense of the apparent effortlessness and speed and perhaps surprise of some creative acts. Because this skill is the consequence of the expert's cognitive labors within her domain, so those labors that are part of the etiology of her perceptual skills, something for which she bears responsibility, she's to be credited for instances when those skills deploy automatically and seemingly without effort. So that's how you make sense of both the agency, I think, and novelty. So it's in this sense that some creative individuals, I think, are perceptual experts. Some instances of creativity involve instances of perceptual expertise. And the first, I think, can be partly explained in novel ways by the second. Okay, thanks very much. We take a break or